Local productions on QTV are made possible with support from viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello everyone, welcome to Junia Doan's The Spark. I'm Junia Doan and thank you for tuning in. While sailing through the Panama Canal, I met Scott Kelly, retired captain of the U.S. Navy and former NASA astronaut. Scott is best known for spending nearly a year on the International Space Station and for spending 520 days in space, which puts him on the list of Americans who have spent the most time in space. I'm excited to share our conversation with you. Welcome, Scott. I'm really thrilled you're here. Great opportunity for me and our wonderful audience all over the world and in Michigan. You were in space 4 times and 340 days on one of the trips. What have you noticed about your body that's different, or have you?
Well, there's a few types of differences, right? And effects. There's the, like signs and symptoms, right? There's the things you feel and the things you don't. And when I, got back on each one of my missions, I felt the effects of being in space. And the longer you're there, the more the effects are. But then there are the changes you don't feel. So my last flight was 3.5 years ago. And actually 4 years ago. Yeah. Last flight was 4 years ago, coming up in March. And it took me about 8 months to feel back to normal. What I'm talking about are things like, muscle soreness and stiffness, swelling in my legs when I would stand up. Rashes and hives because my skin had not touched anything for a really long time, fatigue. So those are the things you feel. And then there are the things that you don't feel. Genetic changes, gene expression, which are genes are DNA, RNA, protein. I had 7% of mine change over the course of the year I was there. But that's not something you feel or notice. My telomeres they improved.
Oh, they improved?
Yes, which was contrary to what the expectation. I don't know. I think they've gone back to normal since. Actually, I know they have. I had changes in my microbiome. Those are things you can't feel. Effects on the structural changes I had in my eyes have not gone back to normal, but they don't bother me. It is not something I think about or worry about. Did get a lot of radiation in space, which could be concerning over the course of my life, but again, I don't really dwell on it a whole lot.
Did you get more radiation than a person taking a normal plane at 30,000 feet?
Oh yeah, a lot more. I don't know the number of, the units we use are millisieverts.
Okay.
And what I got over the course of I think my whole career, over the course of the mission was like 180 millisieverts of radiation, which is a fairly good amount. But it's 10%. If we went to Mars, I would get an order of magnitude more, or whoever went to Mars. So you get a lot more radiation going to Mars. I got about 1/10 of what I would have gotten if I went on a mission to Mars. And that's when it gets really dangerous, is that, if I had 10 times the radiation exposure that I had in my career, it would be a real concern for future, risk of fatal cancers, as an example.
I want to talk about Mars, but I just want to follow up on one other aspect of this. Do you think you had any form of post-traumatic stress syndrome? I mean, people go to war, they have loud noises, they have really hard lives. Was there any part of that experience that ricocheted back on you?
I don't know if I would call it PTSD, because I think that would I would feel like that would kind of take away from the people that really have PTSD. But what I did have, and what I did notice, is that when you go from doing something that is, highly technical, highly challenging, your lifelong goal, and then you leave it, and you're doing something completely different that's not as rewarding, not as risky, there is an emotional effect and an adjustment period to that. And I would say, when people ask me how long did it take for me to feel back to normal after my space flight, I would say the last thing I kind of got used to was my new life. I wouldn't really describe it as PTSD, but it is not easy leaving the job of being an astronaut and going on to something else. There is an emotional effect of doing that. It is challenging.
Because you're away from the team and you're away from the challenge, and the other new life is perhaps a little less vital, or less interesting.
All that. I'm no longer doing a job where if I don't focus and pay attention to what I'm doing, I could be risking my life, the lives of my crewmates. I could be risking, the multi-million-dollar hardware I'm working on. So the ramifications of not doing your job well are much, much less now. And it makes it just
flatter.
It's just so much different than what I was used to. I mean, I went from, being a fighter pilot to a test pilot to an astronaut to then talking about being a fighter pilot, a test pilot, and an astronaut.
Yes. So I find that there's like a psychological change just for what you're saying now. There's vitality, there's missions, there are goals, they're measurable, and if you goof up, there's real serious consequences. But as the leader, how did you keep yourself or keep everybody harmonious while you were up there?
So I was the commander on this last mission. I was the commander of the space station for half of the time. The first half, it was two other guys, an American for a few months, and then this Russian cosmonaut his name is Gennady Padalka, great guy. He's actually the guy that has the most time in space of any human. And then I was the commander for 6 months. And part of being the commander is making sure your team is functioning well, everyone's getting along, you're getting the mission accomplished. And I always felt like the way I was able to do that well was keeping things in the right perspective, making sure that people focused on, the stuff that was really, really important, the safety of the mission, of our physical safety. Focus on the work, but not to the point where it is, you try to make everything perfect all the time, because that will just wear you down and is really unsustainable over the course of a whole mission. I flew in space one time with a couple of space shuttle crew members when they first got up there, and they tried to initially use this space shuttle mentality that, everything has to be perfect at all the time. And they actually argued with me about it for the first few weeks. And I said, okay, well, if that's what you want to do, go for it, try it out, see how it works. And then after, 2 or 3 weeks, they're like, well, we can't do this for an entire 6 months. So, just kind of trying to keep things in the right perspective. Make sure everyone gets their exercise, make sure they rest when required, and then also have a good relationship with the ground, because you have your team in space, but the ground, the control center in Houston and the other control centers around the world are just as big a part of the team and need to be included, and they need to feel like they're part of the team as well.
You know, you're very funny when you wish to be. What's the role of humor in space?
I think it's the role I think humor is an important part of life. It's it helps you stay grounded. It keeps things in perspective. I think timing and humor is the most critical thing.
How do you learn that?
Watch great comedians. See what you could be off for half a second in your timing, and it could just throw off the whole thing. Yeah.
Interesting. So if people have fights in space, what's the best way of taking that down a notch?
I've never seen people actually have a like a drawn out, knockdown kind of argument. I have seen people have challenges. I was in space with a couple of cosmonauts that wouldn't talk to each other for months.
I was wondering about that. If there was how would you talk?
I didn't really notice it until one of them was getting ready to leave. And it took me a while to notice it.
Because you were all talking mechanical talk?
Well, because the space station's really big, and one of the cosmonauts sleeps in the U.S. side of the space station, but the other two guys sleep in the Russian side. So, and we wouldn't interact much during the day, during the working hours, and I guess I just never really noticed that they really didn't talk to each other unless they had to.
They had a simplified style, maybe, in space?
I wouldn't say that. They're great guys. Have been great.
And trained like you were?
Yeah, for the most part. We train in Russia. They train in the U.S. We share the space station. We share a lot of the responsibilities, although the Russian Space Agency has their own science program. We have our own. So, during the daytime, you don't interact too much. You'll see each other kind of in passing.
There's a whole group of Americans who believe we have been visited by aliens or UFOs. Are these Army people out there testing things? Is that just imagination? Maybe you can't say.
No, I could say. I've never experienced any aliens. I was always hoping, I'd open the window in the morning,
right,
and I was always hoping there'd be an alien, flying saucer floating next to us.
Never been kidnapped?
Never happened. No.
So on Mars, what are the issues that technically need to be solved to make that doable, if we want to do it?
When I was on the space station this last time, a reporter asked me, he said, it was over the radio, obviously, he said, now that NASA has determined that there is liquid water on Mars some time of the year, will that help us get there any quicker? And I said, I don't know, maybe. Now, if we found money on Mars, then we get there really fast.
In our denomination.
Yeah, because really it's, and I'll quote my brother that he says, going to Mars is not about rocket science, it's about political science. It's about getting the support, consistent funding, consistent planning. NASA's often asked to do things that they're not budgeted to do.
Right.
They're saying, hey, do this, here's not enough money, go and do it. Then 4 years later, you get a new president, you get a brand new plan. Doesn't matter whether Democrat or Republican. We love the support we get, but the plan always changes. So it's kind of hard to be successful with not enough money and a changing plan. Technically, though, the challenges of going to Mars, the biggest one has to do with human health, and it's the radiation. So you're going to either have to, it's like I was saying, if the radiation I got, you would get 10 times as much going to Mars. And that's when it really, really gets critical and puts you at a very much higher risk, almost an unacceptable risk of getting a fatal cancer in your lifetime as a result of your radiation exposure. So we need to either have to figure out how to shield the crew from the radiation, or just get there a lot faster.
Oh, interesting. So it's the matter of sheathing the capsule or the person?
Yeah.
Or changing the DNA?
Yeah. Potentially. there's a company I was talking to recently that was talking about kind of putting people in like almost like a science fiction type of stasis or like deep sleep, to where then it would be easier to shield them potentially, because you could put like lead clothes on them as an example.
Yeah.
So there are interesting ways of doing this. There's we're protected by the magnetic field of the Earth.
Yes.
And you could potentially create a magnetic field around the spacecraft with the propulsion system, as an example.
I could imagine, separate from who's president or which party's in, there would be tension within the organization. Do you go back and forth to the moon or the space station, or do you look beyond? Is there such a thing, or is there another thing? Maybe you can't say.
Well, there's always people that are believers in, hey, we've been to the moon, we need to go to Mars, forget about the moon. I'm a believer of that. It seems like the moon was put there for us to practice to go to Mars. It's 2 to 3 days away instead of 2 to 300. It's got a sixth of the Earth's gravity instead of a third of the Earth's gravity like Mars does. And less gravity makes certain things easier. It's got no atmosphere compared to a little bit of atmosphere on Mars, which can make some of your the propulsion, the landing problem easier. So, but we don't have an unlimited amount of money, and if you can only afford to do one thing, I would say we should just go directly to Mars.
Take the risk.
Yeah.
Yeah. Be bold.
Yeah.
Do it.
Yeah, it's risky.
Some of our richer people are funding that. They want to, Musk and so forth, repopulate. And what would it take to do that?
To like terraform Mars?
Yeah,
or just
to make it so we have a little town, Mars City.
Well, I wouldn't want to live in an enclosed environment, a habitat for the rest of my life. But I guess theoretically, you could, build a space station on Mars and resupply the people indefinitely. Sometimes you hear Elon Musk talking about terraforming Mars, and when Elon said he was going to land the 2 first stages of the rocket on the barge, I used to say, he's crazy. So I'm never going to say that again, because he went and did it. So I guess theoretically it's possible. I'm a big believer, though, that no matter how bad we make this planet, no matter how bad we destroy it, it will always be easier to live here than it would be on Mars. So I think our reason for going to Mars is it's not a lifeboat for planet Earth, I don't think.
What qualities did you have that someone should have if they dream to become an astronaut, or at least technically involved in this kind of a program?
Yeah, everyone's different, but I think the important qualities to operating well in space is, and you don't have to be the best at everything either, but certainly you have to be technically competent. You have to be able to perform the technical functions of operating the spacecraft, understanding the systems, being able to do the tasks that are asked of you as an astronaut. But it goes much beyond that. I mean, you have to be someone who can get along well with others in a very challenging environment, in a closed space for long periods of time. You have to have good teamwork, good leadership skills. You have to, I think, be comfortable enough yourself with living in this small spaces. I think understanding, like I was saying earlier, that everything can't be perfect. You have to understand when it's time to focus 100% of your energy on something, but other times when it's time to just say, like, better is the enemy of good enough, and this is good enough, because you can't, I think, operate at 100% for months on end. So I think those kind of skills are very important to have. But then again, everyone's different. I think what I've learned, working at NASA as compared to when I was in the U.S. Navy, is that we have a very diverse group of people, and having people that are different backgrounds, different experiences, different cultures, different whatever, makes you a stronger team, because you have people that have different perspectives and different ideas, different ways to solve problems.
Interesting. So I remember in the early days of astronaut life, there was, at least in the paper, a public discussion or a private discussion. Who were the real risk takers? The test pilots who were doing the early work, or the people that were put in capsules? Is that kind of discussion faded? Do you do more now as an astronaut, or even less?
Yeah. Well, I think, in the early days of the space program, they were trying to decide, well, who should the crew members be? What community should astronauts come from? So I think that kind of debate was natural then. As the space program developed, we realized, eventually, hey, these spacecraft are really, flight test vehicles, so it's important to have test pilots testing them. But then, like with the space shuttle, even though every flight was a test flight, you had more crew members on board, and it was important to have people with various scientific backgrounds. But I think being a test pilot and having test pilots involved in space flight are probably not always, but for the foreseeable future is going to be part of the space program. Because if I use the space shuttle as an example, it flew 140 times, and if you were going to certify an aircraft for commercial operations, it would fly thousands of times before you would do that. So that's why every flight is a test flight.
Scary. Or exciting. Challenging.
Be both. All of those things.
Well, I get claustrophobia, and all I can think about are these poor guys up there. How do they self-manage? Maybe they don't even ever feel that. But what did you have to wrestle with inside yourself during that long period?
Well, I always, the challenges for me had to do with, what's happening with your family on the ground. I had my first long flight. My sister-in-law, Gabrielle Giffords, was shot when I was in space. So, dealing with that kind of personal tragedy, dealing with, having young kids and the challenges that they run into, and not being able to talk to them whatever I wanted, not being able to be around them and help them with things that they needed. I was always more worried about the physical safety and emotional well-being of my family members than I was myself.
Did it change your relationship once you got back down? Were they annoyed? Were they proud? All of it? What did they say to you?
I think they were mostly, proud of my accomplishments. If you consider my kids, though, they do not remember a time in their lives when both their father and their uncle weren't astronauts. So it was kind of like not that big of a deal to them.
Yeah, I can understand that. So what challenges are you making for yourself now? You seem to be a guy that likes that, thrives in that kind of thought pattern.
I'll tell you, my wife and I are building a house right now, and I'll tell you what, that can strain a relationship. So that's a challenge.
No,
we do it together. Yeah, we do it together, but it's interesting. It's I think when you do something like that, if it doesn't completely destroy your relationship, probably makes you stronger. Whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger, kind of thing.
I remember fighting with my late husband on the placement of a door. I wanted to pull doors with some privacy, and he didn't. And so I was sitting there, and I said, I want this as a birthday present. And he said, here's how you do it. Technically, he's an engineer. So yes, that's really true. I think a life of meaning is more interesting and satisfying.
Oh, of course.
And so what I was listening for is, how do you create meaning other than the house, just inside yourself?
I work with different organizations. I do some stuff with the United Nations, but I'm still a few years removed from having this incredible experience, this incredible career, and I'm actually still kind of trying to figure that out. What is what's next for me for the remainder of my life. I'm not too sure. My brother's running for public office in Arizona. He's running for the U.S. Senate.
Good for him.
John McCain's old seat.
Yes.
So, I think he's got a pretty good chance. We'll see how he does.
And then you'll take it up yourself?
Maybe.
Interesting. People look to leaders. I'm really surprised in our time we don't have that as a template to be in life. Wherever you are in life, make sure you stand for the right things. So when you get to having the conversations inside of you, there's the physical challenge, there's the leadership challenge, there's the family challenge. Does your wife want to be a politician's wife?
Probably not. Yeah.
Not her style.
Yeah, I don't think she'd be that. I don't know if she'd be that into it. Maybe. We haven't really talked about it.
What I noticed is when people are in leadership positions and then they segue away, they don't have anybody to hand things to get it done. And that is a real comeuppance in terms of self-value, but also just efficacy. It's just difficult to get it done if you don't have a host of people supporting you, I can say.
Yeah.
So this is your second wife, right?
Yes.
And is she, none of my business, but is she different from your first wife, or are you different stages of life?
No, they're different.
And did you purposely look for that?
No.
Random. Would you care to tell the story of how you met and romanced? I always like stories of romance.
Well, she worked at NASA in public affairs, but so she knew who I was. I knew who she was, but we were not friends or anything. But then later on, after I was divorced, she was actually, when I was, to be technically accurate, I was in the process of getting divorced. Probably about 6-9 months after that. I just saw her out in town one day, and we struck up a conversation and kind of went from there.
I always love romantic stories. I really do. Anyway, thank you, Scott, very much. I'm going to just say
You're welcome.
one word in the wrap-up. So we've learned a great deal today, and that is find your métier, find what you care to do, and know how physically strong you are and mentally strong, because this is the life of adjustment. This is a life of pieces of what do I want to say, of achievement or challenging yourself. And ask yourself, are you that kind of person or not? It's perfect. We need everybody, so this is a good idea. I do think the role of humor is very important, as he says, in life, not just in his particular line of life. I do think good relationships are, and I do think self-control is. And what he is saying, that life he chose to live required attention, but he did not hold himself to 100% because it's not doable. He also has the flexibility to get along with cosmonauts and just everybody else. So human relationships become very important in any part you do. So thank you for tuning in. Remember, go out and do something kind for someone you know and someone you don't know. Do it every day, smile, and be generous. And thank you for tuning in. I'll see you next week. Thank you, Scott.
To contact Junia, send her an email at juniadownsthespark@gmail.com. For more information, program schedules, and news about future guests, go to www.juniadownthespark.com. Thank you for joining us. See you next time on Junia Doan's The Spark.
Local productions on QTV are made possible with support from viewers like you. Thank you.